Elena's alarm buzzed at 4:45 a.m., not with a jarring beep but with the soft chime of a piano note, C major to be exact. It was the same tone she'd recorded herself playing years ago, back when she still believed music could be more than just a secret part of her life. She reached out from under the thin blanket, fingers brushing the phone to silence it before it could wake her neighbor through the paper-thin walls of her one-room apartment. The room was small, just enough space for a twin bed, a folding table that doubled as her desk and dining surface, a second-hand dresser with a wobbly drawer, and in the corner, her pride and quiet joy, a used digital piano with slightly yellowed keys and a power cord held together by electrical tape. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Outside, Nashville was still asleep, the city wrapped in that hushed blue-gray light that comes just before dawn. No traffic yet, no honking, no sirens, just the distant hum of a refrigerator in the unit next door, and the occasional sigh of wind through the old oak tree outside her window. She stretched, her shoulders stiff from yesterday's double shift, and padded barefoot to the tiny kitchenette. The coffee pot gurgled to life as she filled the kettle for her morning tea. Chamomile because caffeine made her hands shake, and shaky hands were no good on piano keys. By 5:15, she was at the keyboard. No warm-up exercises, no metronome ticking like a stern schoolteacher. She just placed her fingers where they belonged and began to play. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple improvisation, a few chords drifting into a melody she'd been turning over in her head all week. Her fingers moved like they remembered something her mind had forgotten: how to fly. The music filled the room, soft but sure, wrapping around the chipped paint and the grocery bags stacked by the door, turning the ordinary into something tender, something true. She'd been playing since she was 6. Her grandmother, who raised her in a small town outside Memphis, had an upright piano in the living room that smelled like lemon polish and old hymnals. Every Sunday after church, her abuela would sit her on the bench and say, "Mija, music is God's way of whispering when the world gets too loud." Elena didn't know if she believed in God the way her grandmother did, but she believed in that whisper. She believed in the way a minor chord could hold your sadness without judgment, how a rising scale could feel like hope climbing stairs. But life doesn't always let you follow the music. When her grandmother passed away during Elena's senior year of high school, the piano went to a cousin who lived 3 states away. College applications got set aside. Bills needed paying. She moved to Nashville because someone told her it was a city that loved music, and maybe, just maybe, it would love her too. Now at 28, she worked at the Oak and Ivy, a restaurant tucked into a tree-lined street downtown, all dark wood and low lighting, where the wine list cost more than her weekly grocery budget. She wore a crisp black blouse and black slacks, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, name tag pinned just so. She smiled when she served, remembered regulars' favorite dishes, refilled water glasses before they were empty. She was good at her job, not because she loved waiting tables but because she understood people. She saw the lonely businessman who ordered the same steak every Thursday, the couple celebrating their anniversary with trembling hands and quiet laughter, the group of friends trying to cheer up someone who'd just lost a parent. She learned to read the silence between words, the way a person's eyes flickered when they were hurting or hiding something. Maybe that's why she played piano the way she did, because she knew how to listen. Her days blurred together in a rhythm of coffee, commute, service, tips, exhaustion, and then, always, the piano. She took the bus to work, 40 minutes each way, headphones in, listening not to pop songs or podcasts but to recordings of Glenn Gould, Martha Argerich, even old jazz sessions from the 1950s. She'd close her eyes and imagine her fingers on a real grand piano, not the slightly sticky keys of her digital one, but something with weight, with soul, with resonance that filled a room like breath. At the Oak and Ivy, no one knew about her music. Not really. Once a customer had asked if she played anything and she'd laughed it off. Just the radio, she'd said. She didn't want pity, didn't want to be the sad waitress with a dream. She wanted to be seen for her work, for her care, for the way she remembered how Mrs. Callahan liked her tea. 2 sugars, splash of cream stirred 3 times. That mattered. That was real, but sometimes late at night. After counting her tips and setting aside rent money and grocery cash, she'd sit at her keyboard and play something wild and fast, something full of fire and longing. She'd play until her fingers ached and her eyes burned from lack of sleep. And in those moments, she wasn't a waitress. She was just Elena, alive, unguarded, speaking in a language that needed no translation. The restaurant owner, Mr. Dawson, had noticed her once. Not her music, she'd never played there, but the way she moved. Calm under pressure, graceful even when carrying 3 plates and a tray of drinks. He'd said, "You've got rhythm in your bones." Hid. She'd just smiled and said, "Guess I do." She didn't tell him that rhythm came from years of counting beats in her head while walking to the bus stop, from tapping out syncopated patterns on the steering wheel of her old car before it finally gave out last winter. Her apartment wasn't much, but it was hers. She kept it clean, not out of pride, but because clutter made her anxious. Every surface had a purpose. The folding table held her sheet music, printed from free online archives, annotated in pencil with fingerings and dynamics. The wall above her bed had a single framed photo, her and her grandmother standing in front of that old piano, both of them smiling like they knew a secret the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet. Money was always tight. Some weeks she skipped meals to afford new sheet music or to replace the broken pedal on her keyboard. She didn't complain. She'd learned early that life wasn't fair, but it could still be beautiful if you knew where to look. And for her, beauty lived in the spaces between notes, in the quiet after a perfectly placed chord, in the way music could make time slow down or speed up, depending on what your heart needed. She never posted her playing online, never auditioned for gigs. She told herself it was because she wasn't ready. But deep down, she feared that if she put herself out there and failed, the dream would die. Better to keep it safe, tucked away like a letter you never send, precious because it's untouched. Still, she practiced. Every morning, every night, even on her days off, even when her feet throbbed from standing 12 hours straight, even when a rude customer snapped at her for bringing the wrong dressing. She'd come home, wash her face, change into soft cotton pajamas, and sit at the keys, and the music would meet her there, patient, waiting, ready to hold whatever she needed to release. One evening, after a particularly rough shift, 2 no-shows on her section, a spilled bottle of expensive red wine, and a guest who accused her of eye-rolling when she hadn't, she sat down to play and couldn't find the notes. Her fingers fumbled. Her mind was foggy with fatigue and frustration. She almost gave up. But then she remembered her grandmother's voice. When you can't find the song, just breathe. The music is already inside you. You just have to get quiet enough to hear it. So she closed her eyes, breathed in, breathed out, and started again, slowly, gently, like she was coaxing a shy animal from the woods. And soon the melody returned. Not perfect, not polished, but honest. And that was enough. That was always enough. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change. Not because she asked for it. Not because she posted a viral video or sent out 100 resumes. But because someone was about to hear her play and really listen. And sometimes that's all it takes. One person hearing the truth in your music when you've spent years playing it only for yourself. But for now, in this quiet morning, with the coffee cooling on the counter and the first rays of sun slipping through the blinds, Elena played on. The city outside began to stir. Cars started, doors slammed, a dog barked 2 blocks away. But in her small room there was only the piano, her hands, and the quiet certainty that no matter what the day brought, she would always have this moment, this music, this part of herself that no one could take away. She finished her piece with a soft, lingering chord that faded into silence. Then she stood, stretched, and turned off the keyboard. Time to get ready for work. Black blouse, black slacks, name tag, smile. She glanced at the photo of her grandmother on the way out the door. I'm still playing. Abuela, she whispered. And with that, she stepped out into the waking city, carrying her music inside her like a secret flame. Friday nights at the Oak and Ivy always felt different, like the air itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. The usual hum of conversation grew louder. Laughter rang out with more ease, and the clink of wine glasses sounded almost musical. For the staff, it meant longer hours, faster steps, and sharper focus. For Elena, it also meant the quiet hope that maybe tonight, just maybe, someone would see her not just as the woman who brought the breadbasket, but as someone who carried more inside her than they could guess. She'd arrived early, as she always did, to check her station, polish her tray, and mentally prepare. Her feet already ached from yesterday's double shift, but she didn't complain. Complaining didn't fill your gas to her. NK or pay your electric bill. She tied her apron, smoothed her bun, and took a deep breath in the dim hallway behind the kitchen. The scent of seared duck and rosemary filled the air, mingling with the faint tang of lemon cleaner. She loved this place in a strange, complicated way, not because it was glamorous, but because it was steady. It gave her a rhythm, a role, a reason to get up when the world felt heavy. Tonight, the restaurant had a private party booked in the back corner, the most coveted section, shielded by tall potted ferns and soft amber lighting. A group of 8, all dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine. Tailored suits, silk blouses, watches that probably cost more than Elena's car had when it still ran. They'd reserved the whole alcove for a celebration, someone's promotion maybe, or a birthday. She didn't ask. Her job wasn't to pry, just to serve. She approached their table with water glasses and warm rolls, her steps quiet on the hardwood floor. The group was already deep in conversation, voices rich with confidence, the kind that comes from knowing you belong wherever you go. One man leaned back in his chair, laughing loudly at something another had said. A woman with perfectly coiffed hair sipped her cocktail and glanced at Elena with polite indifference, the kind of look you give a doorknob or a coat rack. Elena set down the rolls, offered a soft enjoy, and turned to leave. That's when it happened. Her foot caught slightly on the edge of the thick rug beneath the table. Just a tiny stumble, nothing dramatic, but her hand jerked. And a single drop of creme brulee sauce from the dessert tray she was prepping nearby splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth. Time seemed to slow. She froze. Her stomach dropped like she'd missed a step in the dark. Oh, I'm so sorry," she said quickly, already reaching for a clean napkin from her apron pocket. Her voice was calm, but inside her heart hammered against her ribs. Then came the laughter. Not the kind you share with friends over a funny story. This was sharper, amused, almost mocking. The man who'd been leaning back let out a loud chuckle. "Careful there. Maybe leave the fancy moves to the dancers, huh?" The woman with the perfect hair smirked into her glass. "Honestly, you'd think they'd train you better before letting you near a $200 dessert." Elena's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes down, gently blotting the spot. She didn't snap back. Didn't sigh. Didn't let her hands shake, even though they wanted to. She'd been here before. Not this exact moment, but the feeling. Invisible, replaceable, less than. "It won't happen again," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the heat in her chest. She finished cleaning, gave a small nod, and walked away, spine straight, shoulders relaxed like nothing had happened. But inside, it stung. Not because their words were especially cruel. They weren't, not really. But because they saw her as just a body in a uniform, a pair of hands that existed only to serve them. They didn't see the woman who'd practiced Chopin until her fingers cramped last night, who saved every extra tip for piano lessons she couldn't afford, who carried her grandmother's lullabies in her bones like a second heartbeat. Back in the service hallway, she took a slow breath, pressing her forehead against the cool tile wall for just a second. Then she straightened up, smoothed her apron, and got back to work. There were other tables to check on, drinks to refill, desserts to deliver. The night didn't stop for hurt feelings. What she didn't know was that Mr. Dawson, the owner, a quiet man in his 60s with kind eyes and a habit of noticing things others missed, had seen the whole exchange from the host's stand. He hadn't said anything at the time. He rarely did, but later as he passed her near the kitchen, he touched her elbow lightly. "Don't let them rattle you," he said, voice low. "Some people only know how to measure worth by what's on the surface." She gave him a small smile. "I'm fine, Mr. Dawson." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good, because I've got something planned for later tonight." "Something special," she frowned. "Special?" He just winked and walked away, leaving her puzzled. As the night wore on, the private party grew louder, more relaxed. Bottles of wine came and went. Plates were cleared. Laughter echoed off the high ceilings. Elena moved through it all like a shadow, present but unseen, efficient but unnoticed. She brought coffee, cleared crumbs, offered after-dinner drinks with the same gentle professionalism she always did. The guests barely looked at her now, absorbed in their own world of success and celebration. But one man at the table watched her more closely than the others. He wasn't laughing as loudly. He hadn't joined in the teasing. He'd just watched her clean the spill, noted the way her hands moved, quick, precise, graceful, and then looked down at his own hands, as if comparing. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with tired eyes and a quiet intensity. He hadn't said much all evening, just listened, observed. When Elena brought him a glass of water, he met her eyes and said simply, "Thank you." Not "Hey, sweetheart," or "You're a lifesaver." Just "thank you," like she was a person, not a prop. She nodded, surprised. "You're welcome." That small exchange stayed with her longer than she expected. Around 9:30 p.m., as the last savory plates were cleared and the dessert orders finalized, Mr. Dawson gathered the staff for a quick huddle in the back. His voice was calm but firm. "All right, listen up. In about 20 minutes, we're doing something a little different. I've asked Elena to play a short set on the piano in the lounge. Just 3 or 4 pieces. Keep it classy, keep it warm. It's a surprise for the guests, part of the evening's experience, if you will." Elena's breath caught. "Me?" she whispered, eyes wide. Mr. Dawson smiled. "You've been practicing for years, haven't you? I've heard you humming scales while you wipe down tables. I've seen you tap rhythms on your tray when you think no one's looking. And last month, when the piano tuner was here, you asked him a dozen questions about voicing and regulation like you actually knew what you were talking about." She hadn't realized he'd noticed. "But I've never played in front of people," she said, panic rising. "Not like this. What if I mess up?" "You won't," he said simply. "And even if you do, it won't matter. Because you play from here," he tapped his chest, "not just your fingers. That's what people remember." She wanted to argue, to say no, to hide. But something in his voice, the quiet certainty, made her pause. And then she thought of the man who'd said thank you, like it meant something. And the others who'd laughed like she was nothing. Maybe it was time. She nodded slowly. "Okay." Mr. Dawson squeezed her shoulder. "Go get ready. You've got this." Back in the staff bathroom, she washed her hands carefully, dried them thoroughly, and smoothed her hair. She took off her apron, just for the performance, and straightened her blouse. Her reflection in the mirror looked pale, eyes wide with nerves. She took a deep breath. Just play like you do at home, she told herself, like no one's listening. But tonight people would be listening. Really listening. At 9:55, the lights in the main dining room dimmed slightly. A soft chime sounded over the speakers. Mr. Dawson stepped into the center of the lounge area, near the grand piano, a beautiful, gleaming instrument that rarely got used, mostly for decoration. Most guests assumed it was just part of the ambiance, like the oil paintings or the fresh flowers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Dawson said, his voice warm and clear, "as a special treat to close your wonderful evening, we'd like to share a little music with you. This young woman has been part of our team for over 2 years. She served you your meals, remembered your preferences, and carried your conversations in her heart without ever saying a word. Tonight she's going to speak in a different language, one she's been perfecting since she was a child." He turned and gestured toward the hallway. All eyes turned. Elena stepped out. She didn't walk like a performer. She walked like someone who'd been called to do a task, quiet, focused, a little hesitant. But as she approached the piano, something shifted. Her posture straightened. Her shoulders relaxed. Her hands, which had been clasped tightly in front of her, uncurled. She sat on the bench, adjusted it slightly, placed her hands over the keys. The room was silent now. Even the clinking of ice in glasses had stopped. She closed her eyes for just a second, and then she began. But that moment, the first note, would come in part 3. For now, in this breath between worlds, Elena sat at the piano, heart pounding, surrounded by the very people who'd mocked her just an hour before. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She knew they were there. She knew they expected little, and that was okay. Because the music didn't care about their expectations. It only cared about truth, and she had plenty of that to give. The first note hung in the air, like a single drop of rain before a storm, clear, pure, and full of promise. Elena's fingers, which had trembled just moments before, now moved with a quiet certainty, as if they'd been waiting their whole life for this piano, this moment, this silence. She began with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece she'd learned by ear years ago from an old recording her grandmother used to play on a scratched-up cassette tape. It wasn't flashy. It didn't demand attention with speed or volume. Instead, it invited you in, softly, gently, like someone whispering a secret you didn't know you needed to hear. At first, the guests in the private party barely reacted. Some glanced at their watches. Others exchanged polite, slightly confused smiles as if wondering why the restaurant owner had chosen this particular 4M of entertainment. One woman took a slow sip of her wine, eyebrows raised, clearly expecting something more upbeat, maybe a jazz standard or a pop cover they could hum along to. But as the melody unfolded, something shifted. The man who'd laughed earlier stopped mid-sentence. The woman with the perfect hair set her glass down and didn't pick it up again. Even the staff lingering near the kitchen doors paused in their tracks, trays forgotten in their hands, because this wasn't background music. This was a conversation. Elena played like no one was watching, because in her mind no one was. She'd closed her eyes the moment her fingers touched the keys, retreating into the world she knew best. The one where time slowed, where every note had weight, where silence between chords spoke as loudly as the sound itself. Her hands moved with a grace that came not from showmanship, but from years of practice in a tiny apartment with peeling paint and a keyboard that sometimes skipped notes. She leaned into the phrases, letting them breathe, letting them ache. She didn't rush. She didn't force. She simply let the music be what it needed to be, and what it needed to be was honest. Halfway through the nocturne, a strange thing happened. The room didn't just get quiet, it became still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from boredom, but the deep, almost sacred hush that falls when something real is happening. A couple at a nearby table stopped whispering. A server paused mid-step. Even the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed to fade into the background. It was as if the whole restaurant had taken a breath and forgotten to let it out. The older man, the one who'd said thank you earlier, sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Elena's hands. He'd spent decades in the music world, listening to thousands of performers, judging talent with a practiced ear and a weary heart. He'd heard technical perfection that left him cold. He'd heard virtuosos who played like machines. But this was different. There was vulnerability in her playing, a kind of raw tenderness that couldn't be faked. It reminded him of why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Not for the fame or the applause, but for the way it could hold your pain and your joy in the same phrase. When the final chord of the nocturne faded into silence, no one clapped right away. They just sat there stunned as if waking from a dream they didn't want to leave. Then slowly the older man began to clap, softly at first, then with more conviction. Others joined in, hesitant at first, then louder, until the whole room was filled with warm, genuine applause. But Elena didn't stop. Without opening her eyes, without acknowledging the clapping, she let her hands rest for just a heartbeat, then began again. This time it was something no one recognized. Not a classical piece, not a jazz standard, not a pop song. It was her own. She'd written it during a sleepless night last winter, after a particularly hard shift when the city outside her window felt too big and too lonely. She called it Morning Light on Oak Street, though she'd never told anyone the name. It started with a simple melody in the right hand, gentle and searching like footsteps on an empty sidewalk. Then the left hand joined in with rich, rolling chords that felt like sunrise spilling over rooftops. As the piece built, it wove in elements of gospel, blues, and classical harmony, styles she'd absorbed over years of listening, practicing and living. Her fingers danced now, not with showy flair but with purpose. She leaned into the piano, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm, her foot tapping softly against the pedal. This was her voice, her real voice, the one she'd kept hidden under trays of appetizers and pitchers of iced tea. And now finally she was letting it speak. People leaned forward in their seats. A woman wiped her eyes with the corner of her napkin. The man who'd mocked her earlier stared at his hands, then at Elena, his expression unreadable but his posture changed, less relaxed, more alert, as if he'd just realized he'd been wrong about something important. The music swelled, then pulled back, then rose again like a tide. It wasn't perfect, there was a slight stumble in one passage, a note that rang a fraction too long, but those imperfections only made it more human, more real. And that was what moved people. Not perfection, but truth. When she finished, her hands resting lightly on the keys, the silence returned, but this time it was heavier, thicker, charged with something unspoken. Then, as if on cue, the entire room erupted. Not polite applause, not scattered clapping. A full roaring standing ovation. Chairs scraped back. People rose to their feet. Even the kitchen staff, usually too busy to stop, stood in the doorway, clapping with wide eyes and proud smiles. Mr. Dawson stood near the bar, arms crossed, but his eyes were bright with something that looked a lot like pride. Elena finally opened her eyes. She blinked, disoriented as if waking from a deep sleep. The light seemed too bright, the noise too loud. For a moment she just sat there stunned, her chest rising and falling quickly. Then she stood slowly and gave a small, humble bow, just a nod of her head really, and stepped away from the piano. But before she could slip back into the hallway, the older man from the private party approached her. He didn't reach out to shake her hand or slap her on the back. He just stood a respectful distance away and said, his voice low and steady, "Where have you been hiding that?" Elena looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She saw not judgment, not amusement, but genuine wonder, and maybe a little regret. "I haven't been hiding," she said softly. "I've just been here." He nodded slowly as if that answered everything. "You've got a gift. Not just skill, though you've got plenty of that, but something deeper. You play like you've lived." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just smiled, a real smile this time, not the polite one she wore for customers. Back at the private table, the mood had completely shifted. The group that had laughed an hour ago now sat in quiet awe. The woman who'd made the snide comment about training looked down at her empty wine glass, her cheeks pink. One of the men cleared his throat and said, "Well, I guess we owe someone an apology." No one argued. Meanwhile, a young couple at a nearby table had recorded the last part of her performance on a phone. They weren't being sneaky about it, they just couldn't help themselves. "That was incredible," the woman whispered to her partner as she hit stop on the video. "We have to share this," and they did. Within minutes, the clip was posted to a local community group online. Within an hour, it had been shared dozens of times. By midnight, it had hundreds of views. People commented, "Who is she? Is she a professional? Why is she working as a waitress?" The video didn't show her face clearly, just her hands, the piano, and the back of her head, but it didn't matter. The music spoke for itself. Elena didn't know any of this yet. She'd gone back to the staff room, changed into her street clothes, and sat on a folding chair trying to catch her breath. Her hands still tingled from the playing. Her heart still raced. She felt like she'd run a marathon and climbed a mountain all at once. Mr. Dawson found her there. He didn't say much, just handed her a bottle of water and sat down beside her. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, then shook her head, then laughed, a soft, shaky sound. "I don't know. I think so. You were amazing," he said simply. "Not just good, amazing." She looked at him, eyes glistening. "I was so scared." "I know," he said. "But you did it anyway. That's courage." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the muffled sounds of the restaurant winding down, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of departing guests, the soft jazz now playing over the speakers again. Later, as she walked out to the bus stop, she noticed something on the bench near her usual spot, a folded napkin, weighted down by a $5 bill. She picked it up, unfolded it carefully. In neat handwriting it read, "I was wrong. Thank you for the music." Someone who needed to hear it. She stared at it for a long time. Then she tucked it into her pocket, right next to her bus pass. The night air was cool, the city light soft against the dark sky. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel like just a waitress. She felt seen not for her uniform or her service, but for the part of her that mattered most. And as she waited for the bus, she hummed a few bars of her own song under her breath, smiling to herself. The music wasn't just inside her anymore. It was out in the world, and it was just getting started. The next morning, Elena woke to the sound of her phone buzzing, not once, not twice, but over and over, like a trapped bird fluttering against glass. She fumbled for it, still half asleep, expecting a shift change notice or a reminder about her dentist appointment. Instead, her screen was flooded with notifications. Messages from old friends she hadn't spoken to in years, comments from strangers, even a few tagged posts from local news pages. Her heart jumped into her throat. She tapped on one of the links. It opened a short video, her hands on the piano keys, the back of her head visible, the final minutes of her original piece playing clearly through tinny phone speakers. The caption read, Waitress stuns Nashville crowd with breathtaking piano performance. You won't believe your ears. She stared at it stunned. Someone had filmed her, shared her, and now people were listening. By noon, the video had thousands of views. By evening, it was pushing 50,000. Local radio stations called the Oak and Ivy asking for her name. A reporter from a community paper showed up during lunch service, notebook in hand, asking if she'd be willing to do a short interview. Elena politely declined. She wasn't ready for that kind of attention. But Mr. Dawson gave a brief statement. She's a remarkable young woman with an extraordinary gift. We're all very proud of her. Proud. The word echoed in her mind as she wiped down tables later that day. Proud. Not lucky or surprising or cute for a waitress. Proud. Like she'd earned it. Like she belonged. But the real shock came 2 days later, when the older man from the private party returned, not as a guest but alone during the quiet afternoon lull. He walked in wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans, no entourage, no pretense. He asked for Elena by name. She came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, nervous but curious. I hope I'm not overstepping, he said gently, but I couldn't stop thinking about your playing. I work in music, production, artist development, that sort of thing. I've heard a lot of pianists in my time. But what you did, it wasn't just technique, it was soul. Elena didn't know what to say. She'd imagined this moment 100 times as a teenager. Being discovered, offered a record deal, whisked away to a life of stages and spotlights. But now that it was happening, it felt surreal, almost too fragile to touch. I don't have a demo, she said quietly, or a website. I've never performed outside my apartment. That's okay, he said. Talent like yours doesn't need polish to shine. It just needs a chance. He didn't pressure her, didn't hand her a contract or make big promises. Instead, he asked if she'd be willing to play for him again, just the two of them in a small studio downtown. No audience, no expectations. Just so I can hear it properly, he said, and maybe help you figure out what you want to do next. She thought about it all night. Part of her wanted to say no, to keep her music safe, private, untouched by the messy world of business and expectations. But another part, the part that had stayed up until 2 a.m., practicing scales on a broken keyboard, whispered, "What if this is the door you've been waiting for?" She said yes. The studio was nothing like she'd imagined. No flashy lights or gold records on the wall. Just a cozy room with warm wood floors, a well-loved upright piano, and big windows that let in afternoon sun. The man, she still didn't know his name, and he never offered it, sat in a simple chair, hands folded in his lap, eyes kind. Play whatever feels right, he said. So she did. She played the nocturne again, then her own piece, then a gospel hymn her grandmother used to sing. She even tried a little improvisation, letting her fingers wander where they wanted. He listened, without interrupting, without nodding along like he was waiting for his turn to speak. He just listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You should finish your training. Not because you need fixing, you don't, but because you deserve the tools to take this as far as you want to go." He told her about a music conservatory in the city that offered evening classes and partial scholarships for working adults. He knew someone on the admissions committee. He'd be happy to write a recommendation. Elena's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of being seen, truly seen, after so many years of feeling invisible. But the biggest surprise didn't come from him. It came from the guest who'd mocked her. A week after the performance, a handwritten letter arrived at the Oak and Ivy, addressed to the pianist Waitress. Mr. Dawson handed it to her with a knowing look. Inside was a simple card, no signature, just a few lines in careful handwriting. I laughed that night because I was uncomfortable. Your grace under pressure showed me my own smallness. Your music reminded me that beauty often hides in plain sight. I'm sorry for my words. Thank you for sharing your gift anyway. Tucked inside was a $100 bill, not as a tip, but as a donation to Whatever helps you keep playing. Elena cried in the staff bathroom that day. Not because she needed the money, though she did, but because someone had looked at her, really looked, and chosen to change. Offers began to trickle in. A local church asked if she'd play for their Sunday service. A community center invited her to lead a free workshop for kids. A small jazz club offered her a monthly residency, just 30 minutes, but with a real piano and a proper sound system. She said yes to all of them, carefully, thoughtfully, making sure she could still keep her job at the restaurant. She wasn't ready to leap into the unknown, not yet. But she was ready to dip her toes in. The viral video kept spreading. A national morning show picked it up. A classical music blog wrote a feature. The Waitress Who Plays Like an Angel. Strangers messaged her on social media. She'd finally made a simple account just to respond to kind notes. One woman wrote, "I played your video for my daughter, who's giving up piano because she thinks she's not good enough. After hearing you, she practiced for 2 hours straight." That message meant more to Elena than any headline. At work, everything changed, but not in the way she feared. The staff didn't treat her like a celebrity. If anything, they treated her with more warmth, more quiet respect. The dishwasher, a quiet man who rarely spoke, started humming her melody while he worked. The hostess began saving the best tables near the piano for nights Elena might play. Even the regulars changed. The lonely businessman now lingered after his meal, just to hear her practice during slow hours. The anniversary couple sent her a bouquet with a note. "Your music made our night unforgettable." She still served bread baskets, still refilled water glasses, still wore the same black blouse and name tag. But now, when she walked into a room, people's eyes lit up, not with pity or curiosity, but with genuine appreciation. One evening, as she was closing up, Mr. Dawson handed her an envelope. "Don't open it here," he said with a small smile. At home, she found a check inside, enough to cover 3 months' rent, and a note. "Consider this an investment in your future. Keep playing. The world needs to hear you." She sat on her bed staring at the check, tears streaming down her face. Not because of the money, though it lifted a huge weight, but because someone believed in her enough to bet on her. She didn't quit her job. Not yet. She knew better than to trust sudden fame. But she started planning. She applied to the conservatory. She practiced with new focus, not just for herself anymore, but for all the people who'd written to say her music mattered. She even started writing more, little pieces inspired by bus rides, rainy mornings, the sound of laughter in the restaurant. And every Friday night she played at the Oak and Ivy, not as a surprise, not as a gimmick, but as herself. The first time she returned to the piano after everything, the room fell silent the moment she sat down. No one laughed. No one whispered. They just waited, expectant, respectful. And when she began to play, it wasn't just music, it was a conversation between her and everyone who'd ever felt unseen, unheard, underestimated. Afterward, the older man from the studio came up to her again. "You're ready," he said simply. "Whenever you are." She smiled. "I'm getting there." That night, as she walked home under the Nashville stars, she didn't feel like two people anymore, the waitress and the pianist. She was just Elena, whole, seen, enough. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. 6 months after that night at the Oak and Ivy, Elena stood backstage at the Ryman Auditorium, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The historic venue, once a church, now a temple of music, was packed with people, families, students, music lovers, even a few familiar faces from the restaurant. Tonight wasn't about fame or record deals. It was a benefit concert, and every ticket sold would go toward funding free piano lessons for kids in underfunded schools across the city. She'd helped design the program herself, insisting that half the evening feature young students, some as young as 8, playing pieces they'd practiced for weeks. "If I can give one kid the chance I almost lost," she'd told the organizers, "then this whole thing is worth it." She still worked at the restaurant, though now only weekends, and only because she wanted to, not because she had to. The rest of her time was split between classes at the conservatory, rehearsals, and teaching a few beginner students in a borrowed community center room. Her apartment hadn't changed much, same folding table, same worn rug. But now the corner held sheet music from real composers, not just printouts and a small potted plant someone had given her after a performance. "For your green thumb," the note had said. She didn't have a green thumb, but she watered it every Sunday without fail. Backstage, she smoothed the simple black dress she'd bought secondhand. Nothing flashy, just comfortable, like her old uniform, but softer. She didn't wear heels. Her feet still remembered every hour spent on hard restaurant floors. A stagehand handed her a bottle of water. "You've got 5 minutes," he whispered with a kind smile. She nodded, took a slow breath, and closed her eyes. Not to pray, though she wouldn't have minded if someone did, but to remember. She remembered the alarm at 4:45 a.m., the C major chime, the sticky keys of her old keyboard, the sting of laughter in a quiet dining room, the weight of that napkin with the apology. The first time she played for strangers and didn't run away, the way her grandmother's voice still lived in the spaces between notes. She opened her eyes. She was ready. When she walked onto the Ryman stage, the crowd didn't roar, they rose. Not all at once, but steadily, like a wave building from the back rows to the front. She hadn't even played a note yet. They were standing faux. The idea of her, the waitress who kept playing when no one was listening, who showed up with grace even when she was treated like she didn't matter. She sat at the grand piano, real this time, rich and resonant, its wood gleaming under the stage lights, and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment she just let them rest there, feeling the cool ivory, the familiar shape of home. Then she began. She didn't open with something showy. Instead, she played a new piece she'd written just for tonight, for the ones who waited. It started with a single repeating note in the bass like a heartbeat. Then a melody emerged in the right hand, tender and searching, weaving through harmonies that felt like memory and hope tangled together. Halfway through, the young students joined her on stage, each playing a simple line on upright pianos arranged in a semicircle. Their parts weren't perfect, some missed a beat, one played a wrong note. But Elena didn't flinch. She wove their sounds into hers, turning mistakes into something human, something real. By the end, the whole room was holding its breath. When the final chord faded, silence held for 3 full seconds. Then the auditorium erupted. Not just applause, but cheers, whistles, tears. A little girl in the front row jumped up and down, pointing at the stage like she'd just seen magic. After the concert, people lined up to speak with her. Not for autographs, she still didn't do those, but just to say thank you. A mother hugged her and whispered, "My son wants to learn piano now. He says if you could do it, so can he." A retired teacher pressed a handmade bracelet into her hand. "You reminded me why I taught," she said. Even the older man from the studio was there, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. He didn't say much, just nodded and gave her a look that said, "I knew you would." But the moment that stayed with her happened later as she was packing up her sheet music. A teenager approached, shy, holding a worn notebook. "I work at a diner downtown," she said softly. "I sing when I wash dishes. No one's ever heard me, but after seeing you tonight, I think maybe I should try." Elena looked at her, really looked, and saw herself 10 years ago. Hopeful, scared, full of something no one had noticed yet. "Do it," Elena said, her voice warm. "Sing like no one's listening. And when someone finally does, don't be surprised. You're worth hearing." The girl's eyes filled with tears. She nodded and walked away, clutching her notebook like a promise. Back at her apartment that night, Elena didn't celebrate with champagne or a fancy dinner. She made tea, changed into soft pajamas, and sat at her old digital piano, the one with the taped-up cord. She played for no one but herself, just like always. But now the music felt different. Lighter. Freer. Not because she was famous, she wasn't. Not really, but because she'd stopped hiding. A few weeks later, a local reporter interviewed her for a small feature. "What's next for you?" they asked. She thought for a moment. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe I'll record an album. Maybe I'll teach full-time. Maybe I'll keep playing weekends at the Oak and Ivy. All I know is that I'm not going to stop playing, and I'm not going to forget where I came from." She still wore her name tag when she worked, still remembered how Mrs. Callahan liked her tea, still smiled when she brought the bread basket. But now, when guests asked if she played piano, she didn't laugh it off. She just said, sometimes, and sometimes that was enough. The biggest change wasn't in her schedule or her bank account, it was in how she saw herself. She wasn't the waitress who plays piano or the pianist who used to wait tables. She was just Elena, whole, complex, enough. And that was the real victory. One rainy afternoon, she visited the community center where she now taught. As she walked down the hall, she heard a child practicing scales. Slow, careful, a little clumsy. She paused outside the door, listening. The notes weren't perfect, but they were trying. And in that trying, she heard her own beginning. She didn't go in. She just stood there for a moment, smiling before walking on. Life wasn't a fairy tale. There were still bills, bad days, moments of doubt. But now, when the world felt loud or unkind, she had a place to go. Not just the piano, but the knowledge that her voice mattered. That her story mattered. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there was listening. Not because she was special, but because she dared to play anyway.